The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, a novel by Mark Haddon. Chapter 181. I see everything. That is why I don't like new places. If I am in a place I know, like home or school or the bus or the shop or the street, I have seen almost everything in it beforehand, and all I have to do is look at the things that have changed or moved. For example, one week the Shakespeare's Globe poster had fallen down in the classroom at school, and you could tell because it had been put back slightly to the right, and there were three little circles of blue tack stain on the wall down the left-hand side of the poster. And the next day someone had graffitied Crow Aptok to lamppost 437 in our street, which is the one outside number 35. But most people are lazy. They never look at everything. They do what is called glancing, which is the same word for bumping off something and carrying on in almost the same direction, e.g., when a snooker ball glances off another snooker ball. And the information in their head is really simple. For example, if they are in the countryside, it might be 1. I am standing in a field that is full of grass. 2. There are some cows in the fields. 3. It is sunny with a few clouds. 4. There are some flowers in the grass. 5. There is a village in the distance. 6. There is a fence at the edge of the field, and it has a gate in it. And then they would stop noticing anything, because they would be thinking something else like, "Oh, it is very beautiful here," or "I'm worried that I might have left the gas cooker on," or "I wonder if Julie has given birth yet." This is really true, because I asked Siobhan what people thought about when they looked at things, and this is what she said. But if I am standing in a field in the countryside, I notice everything. For example, I remember standing in a field on Wednesday, 15th of June 1994, because Father and Mother and I were driving to Dover to get a ferry to France, and we did what Father called taking the scenic route, which means going by little roads and stopping for lunch in a pub garden. And I had to stop to go for a wee, and I went into a field with cows in it. And after I'd had a wee, I stopped and looked at the field, and I noticed these things. 1. There were 19 cows in the field, 15 of which are black and white, and 4 of which are brown and white. 2. There is a village in the distance which has 31 visible houses and a church with a square tower and not a spire. 3. There are ridges in the field, which means that in medieval times it was what is called a ridge and furrow field, and people who lived in the village would have a ridge each to do farming on. 4. There is an old plastic bag from Asda in the hedge, and a squashed Coca-Cola can with a snail on it, and a long piece of orange string. 5. The northeast corner of the field is highest, and the southwest corner is lowest. I had a compass because we were going on holiday, and I wanted to know where Swindon was when we were in France. And the field is folded down slightly along the line between these two corners, so that the northwest and southeast corners are slightly lower than they would be if the field was an inclined plane. 6. I can see 3 different types of grass and 2 colors of flowers in the grass. 7. The cows are mostly facing uphill. And there were 31 more things in this list of things I noticed, but Siobhan said I didn't need to write them all down. And it means that it is very tiring if I am in a new place because I see all of these things. And if someone asked me afterwards what the cows looked like, I could ask them which one, and I could do a drawing of them at home and say that a particular cow had patterns on it like this. And I realized that I told a lie in chapter 13 because I said I cannot tell jokes, because I do know 3 jokes that I can tell, and I understand, and one of them is about a cow, and Siobhan said that I didn't have to go back and change what I wrote in chapter 13, because it doesn't matter, because it is not a lie, just a clarification. And this is the joke. There are 3 men on a train. One of them is an economist, and one of them is a logician, and one of them is a mathematician. And they have just crossed the border into Scotland. I don't know why they were going to Scotland. And they see a brown cow standing in a field from the window of the train, and the cow is standing parallel to the train. And the economist says, "Look, the cows in Scotland are brown." And the logician says, "No, there are cows in Scotland of which one at least is brown." And the mathematician says, "No, there is at least one cow in Scotland of which one side appears to be brown." And it is funny because economists are not real scientists, and because logicians think more clearly, but mathematicians are the best. And when I am in a new place, because I see everything, it is like when a computer is doing too many things at the same time, and the central processor unit is blocked up, and there isn't any space left to think about other things. And when I am in a new place and there are lots of people there, it is even harder because people are not like cows and flowers and grass, and they can talk to you and do things that you don't expect. So you have to notice everything that is in the place. And also you have to notice things that might happen as well. And sometimes when I am in a new place and there are lots of people there, it is like a computer crashing, and I have to close my eyes and put my hands over my ears and groan, which is like pressing Control Alt Delete and shutting down programs and turning the computer off and rebooting so that I can remember what I am doing and where I am meant to be going. And that is why I am good at chess and maths and logic, because most people are almost blind and they don't see most things, and there is lots of spare capacity in their heads, and it is filled with things which aren't connected and are silly, like, "I'm worried that I might have left the gas cooker on." Chapter 191. My train set had a little building that was 2 rooms with a corridor between them, and one was the ticket office where you bought the tickets, and one was a waiting room where you waited for the train. But the train station in Swindon wasn't like that. It was a tunnel and some stairs, and a shop and a cafe, and a waiting room like this. But this is not a very accurate map of the station, because I was scared, so I was not noticing things very well, and this is just what I remember, so it is an approximation. And it was like standing on a cliff in a really strong wind, because it made me feel giddy and sick, because there were lots of people walking into and out of the tunnel, and it was really echoey, and there was only one way to go, and that was down the tunnel, and it smelled of toilets and cigarettes. So I stood against the wall and held onto the edge of a sign that said, "Customers seeking access to car park, please use assistant phone opposite, right off the ticket office," to make sure that I didn't fall over and go into a crouch on the ground. And I wanted to go home, but I was frightened of going home. And I tried to make a plan of what I should do in my head, but there were too many things to look at and too many things to hear. So I put my hands over my ears to block out the noise and think. And I thought that I had to stay in the station to get on a train, and I had to sit down somewhere, and there was nowhere to sit near the door of the station, so I had to walk down the tunnel. So I said to myself in my head, not out loud, "I will walk down the tunnel, and there might be somewhere I can sit down, and then I can shut my eyes and I can think." And I walked down the tunnel trying to concentrate on the sign at the end of the tunnel that said, "Warning, CCTV in operation." And it was like stepping off the cliff on a tightrope. And eventually I got to the end of the tunnel, and there were some stairs, and I went up the stairs, and there were still lots of people, and I groaned. And there was a shop at the top of the stairs, and a room with chairs in it, but there were too many people in the room with chairs in it, so I walked past it. And there were signs saying, "Great Western," and "Cold beers and lagers," and "Caution, wet floor," and "Your 50p will keep a premature baby alive for 1.8 seconds," and "Transforming travel," and "Refreshingly different," and "It's delicious, it's creamy, and it's only £1.30 hot choc deluxe," and 0870 777 7676, and "The Lemon Tree," and no smoking, and fine teas. And there were some little tables with chairs next to them, and no one was sitting at one of the tables, and it was in a corner, and I sat down on one of the chairs next to it, and I closed my eyes. And I put my hands in my pockets, and Toby climbed into my hand, and I gave him 2 pellets of rat food from my bag, and I gripped the Swiss Army knife in the other hand, and I groaned to cover up the noise, because I had taken my hands off my ears, but not so loud that other people would hear me groaning and come and talk to me. And then I tried to think about what I had to do, but I couldn't think because there were too many other things in my head. So I did a maths problem to make my head clearer. And the maths problem that I did was called Conway Soldiers. And in Conway Soldiers, you have a chessboard that continues infinitely in all directions, and every square below a horizontal line has a colored tile on it, like this. And you can move a colored tile only if it can jump over a colored tile horizontally or vertically, but not diagonally, into an empty square 2 squares away. And when you move a colored tile in this way, you have to remove the colored tile that it jumped over, like this. And you have to see how far you get the colored tiles above the starting horizontal line. And you start by doing something like this. And then you do something like this. And I know what the answer is, because however you move the colored tiles, you will never get a colored tile more than 4 squares above the starting horizontal line. But it is a good maths problem to do in your head when you don't want to think about something else, because you can make it as complicated as you need to fill your brain by making the board as big as you want and the moves as complicated as you want. And I had got to... And then I looked up and saw that there was a policeman standing in front of me, and he was saying, "Anyone at home?" But I didn't know what that meant. And then he said, "Are you all right, young man?" I looked at him and I thought for a bit so that I would answer the question correctly, and I said, "No." And he said, "You're looking a bit worse for wear." He had a gold ring on one of his fingers, and it had curly letters on it, and I couldn't see what the letters were. Then he said, "The lady at the cafe says you've been here for 2.5 hours, and when she tried talking to you, you were in a complete trance." Then he said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Christopher Boone." And he said, "Where do you live?" And I said, 36 Randolph Street. And I started feeling better because I like policemen, and it was an easy question, and I wondered whether I should tell him that Father killed Wellington, and whether he would arrest Father. And he said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I needed to sit down and be quiet and think." And he said, "Okay, let's keep it simple. What are you doing at the railway station?" And I said, "I'm going to see Mother." And he said, "Mother?" And I said, "Yes, Mother." And he said, "When's your train?" And I said, "I don't know. She lives in London. I don't know when there's a train to London." And he said, "So you don't live with your mother?" And I said, "No, but I'm going to." And then he sat down next to me and said, "So where does your mother live?" And I said, "In London." And he said, "Yes, but where in London?" And I said, 451C Chapter Road, London NW2 5NG. And he said, "Jesus, what is that?" And I looked down and I said, "That's my pet rat, Toby," because he was looking out of my pocket at the policeman. And the policeman said, "A pet rat?" And I said, "Yes, a pet rat. He's very clean and he hasn't got bubonic plague." And the policeman said, "Well, that's reassuring." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Have you got a ticket?" And I said, "No." And he said, Have you got money to get a ticket? And I said, No. And he said, So how precisely were you going to get to London then? And then I didn't know what to say because I had father's cash point card in my pocket and it was illegal to steal things. But he was a policeman, so I had to tell the truth. So I said, I have a cash point card. And I took it out of my pocket and I showed it to him. And this was a white lie. And the policeman said, Is this your card? And then I thought he might arrest me. And I said, No, it's father's. And he said, Father's? And I said, Yes, father's. And he said, Okay. But he said it really slowly, and he squeezed his nose between his thumb and his forefinger. And I said, He told me the number, which was another white lie. And he said, Why don't you and I take a stroll to the cash machine, eh? And I said, You mustn't touch me. And he said, Why would I want to touch you? And I said, I don't know. And he said, Well, neither do I. And I said, Because I got a caution for hitting a policeman, but I didn't mean to hurt him, and if I do it again, I'll get into even bigger trouble. Then he looked at me and he said, You're serious, aren't you? And I said, Yes. And he said, You lead the way. And I said, Where? And he said, Back to the ticket office. And he pointed with his thumb. And then we walked back through the tunnel, but it wasn't so frightening this time because there was a policeman with me. And I put the cash point card into the machine like father had let me do sometimes when we were shopping together, and it said, Enter your personal number. And I typed in 3558 and pressed the enter button, and the machine said, Please enter amount, and there was a choice. And I asked the policeman, How much does it cost to get a ticket for a train to London? And he said, About 30 quid. And I said, Is that pounds? And he said, Christ alive, and then he laughed. But I didn't laugh because I don't like people laughing at me, even if they are policemen. And he stopped laughing and he said, Yeah, it's £30. So I pressed £50 and five £10 notes came out of the machine and a receipt, and I put the notes and the receipt and the card into my pocket. And the policeman said, Well, I guess I shouldn't keep you chatting any longer. And I said, Where do I get a ticket for the train from? Because if you are lost and you need directions, you can ask a policeman. And he said, You're a prize specimen, aren't you? And I said, Where do I get a ticket for the train from? Because he hadn't answered my question. And he said, In there. And he pointed, and there was a big room with a glass window on the other side of the train station door. And then he said, Nah, are you sure you know what you're doing? And I said, Yes, I'm going to London to live with my mother. And he said, Has your mother got a telephone number? And I said, Yes. And he said, And can you tell me what it is? And I said, Yes, it's 0208 887 8907. And he said, And you'll ring her if you get into trouble, okay? And I said, Yes, because I knew you could ring people from phone boxes if you had money. And I had money now. And he said, Good. And I walked into the ticket office and I turned around and I could see that the policeman was still watching me, so I felt safe. And there was a long desk at the other side of the big room, and a window on the desk, and there was a man standing in front of the window, and there was a man behind the window. And I said to the man behind the window, I want to go to London. And the man in front of the window said, If you don't mind. And he turned round so that his back was toward me, and the man behind the window gave him a little bit of paper to sign, and he signed it, and pushed it back under the window, and the man behind the window gave him a ticket. And then the man in front of the window looked at me and he said, What the fuck are you looking at? And then he walked away. And he had dreadlocks, which is what some black people have, but he was white, and dreadlocks is when you never wash your hair and it looks like old rope. and he had red trousers with stars on them, and I kept my hand on my Swiss Army knife in case he touched me. And then there was no one else in front of the window, and I said to the man behind the window, "I want to go to London." And I hadn't been frightened when I was with the policeman, but I turned round and saw that he had gone now, and I was scared again. So I tried to pretend I was playing a game on my computer, and it was called Train to London, and it was like Myst or the 11th Hour, and you had to solve lots of different problems to get to the next level, and I could turn it off at any time. And the man said, "Single or return?" And I said, "What does single or return mean?" And he said, "Do you want to go one way or do you want to go and come back?" And I said, "I want to stay there when I get there." And he said, "For how long?" And I said, "Until I go to university." And he said, "Single then?" And then he said, "That'll be £32. And I gave him the £50 and he gave me back £10 and he said, "Don't you go throwing it away." And then he gave me a little yellow and orange ticket and £8 in coins, and I put it all in my pocket with my knife. And I didn't like the ticket being half yellow, but I had to keep it because it was my train ticket. And then he said, "If you could move away from the counter." And I said, "When is the train to London?" And he looked at his watch and he said, "Platform 1, 5 minutes." And I said, "Where is platform 1?" And he pointed and said, "Through the underpass and up the stairs. You'll see the signs." And underpass meant tunnel, because I could see where he was pointing. So I went out of the ticket office, but it wasn't like a computer game at all, because I was in the middle of it, and it was like all the signs were shouting in my head, and someone bumped into me as they walked past, and I made a noise like a dog barking to scare them off. And I pictured in my head a big red line across the floor, which started at my feet and went through the tunnel, and I started walking along the red line, saying, left, right, left, right, because sometimes when I am frightened or angry, it helps if I do something that has a rhythm to it, like music or drumming, which is something Siobhan taught me to do. And I went up the stairs, and I saw a sign saying Platform 1, and the arrow was pointing at a glass door. So I went through it, and someone bumped into me again with a suitcase, and I made another noise like a dog barking, and they said, "Watch where the hell you're going!" But I pretended that they were just one of the guarding demons in Train to London, and there was a train. And I saw a man with a newspaper and a bag of golf clubs go up one of the doors of the train and press a big button next to it, and the doors were electronic and they slid open, and I liked that. And then the doors closed behind him. And then I looked at my watch, and 3 minutes had gone past since I was at the ticket office, which meant that the train would be going in 2 minutes. And then I went up to the door, and I pressed the big buttons, and the doors slid open, and I stepped through the doors. And I was on the train to London. Chapter 193. When I used to play with my train set, I made a train timetable because I like timetables. And I like timetables because I like to know when everything is going to happen. And this was my timetable when I lived at home with Father, and I thought that Mother was dead from a heart attack. This was the timetable for a Monday, and also it is an approximation. 5:20 a.m. Wake up. 5:25 a.m. Clean teeth and wash face. 5:30 a.m. Give Toby food and water. 7:40 a.m. Have breakfast. 8 a.m. Put school clothes on. 8:05 a.m. Pack school bag. 8:10 a.m. Read book or watch video. 8:32 a.m. Catch bus to school. 8:43 a.m. Go past tropical fish shop. 8:51 a.m. Arrive at school. 9 a.m. School assembly. 9:15 a.m. First morning class. 10:30 a.m. Break. 10:50 a.m. Art class with Mrs. Peters. In the art class we do art, But in the first morning class and the first afternoon class and the second afternoon class, we do lots of different things, like reading and tests and social skills and looking after animals and what we did at the weekend and writing and maths and stranger danger and money and personal hygiene. 12:30 p.m. lunch. 1 p.m. first afternoon class. 2:15 p.m. second afternoon class. 3:30 p.m. catch school bus home. 3:49 p.m. get off school bus at home. 3:50 p.m. have juice and snack. 3:55 p.m. give Toby food and water. 4 p.m. take Toby out of his cage. 4:18 p.m. put Toby into his cage. 4:20 p.m. watch television or video. 5 p.m. read a book. 6 p.m. have tea. 6:30 p.m. watch television or a video. 7 p.m. do maths practice. 8 p.m. have a bath. 8:15 p.m. get changed into pajamas. 8:20 p.m. play computer games. 9 p.m. watch television or a video. 9:20 p.m. have juice and a snack. 9:30 p.m. go to bed. And at the weekend I make up my own timetable and I write it down on a piece of cardboard and I put it up on the wall. And it says things like feed Toby or do maths or go to the shop to buy sweets. And that is one of the other reasons why I don't like France. Because when people are on holiday, they don't have a timetable. And I had to get mother and father to tell me every morning exactly what we were going to do that day to make me feel better. Because time is not like space. And when you put something down somewhere, like a protractor or a biscuit, you can have a map in your head to tell you where you have left it. But even if you don't have a map, it will still be there, because a map is a representation of things that actually exist, so you can find the protractor or the biscuit again. And the timetable is a map of time, except that if you don't have a timetable, time is not there, like in the landing or the garden and the route to school. Because time is only the relationship between the way different things change, like the earth going round the sun, and atoms vibrating, and clocks ticking, and day and night, and waking up and going to sleep. And it is like west or nor-east, which won't exist when the earth stops existing and falls into the sun, because it is only a relationship between the North Pole and the South Pole, and everywhere else, like Mogadishu and Sunderland and Canberra. And it isn't a fixed relationship like the relationship between our house and Mrs. Shear's house, or like the relationship between 7 and 865. But it depends on how fast you are going relative to a specific point. And if you go off in a spaceship and you travel near the speed of light, you may come back and find that all your family is dead and you are still young, and it will be the future, but your clock will say that you have only been away for a few days or months. And because nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, this means that we can only know about a fraction of the things that go on in the universe, like this. And this is a map of everything and everywhere, and the future is on the right and the past is on the left, and the gradient of the line C is the speed of light. And we can't know about the things which happen in the shaded areas, even though some of them have already happened. But when we get to F, it will be possible to find out about things which happened in the lighter areas P and Q. And this means that time is a mystery, and not even a thing, and no one has ever solved the puzzle of what time is exactly. And so, if you get lost in time, it is like being lost in a desert, except that you can't see the desert, because it is not a thing. And this is why I like timetables, because they make sure that you don't get lost in time. Chapter 197. There were lots of people on the train, and I didn't like that, because I don't like lots of people I don't know, and I hate it even more if I am stuck in a room with lots of people I don't know, and a train is like a room, and you can't get out of it when it's moving. And it made me think of when I had to come home in the car from school one day because the bus had broken down, and Mother came and picked me up. And Mrs. Peters asked Mother if she could take Jack and Polly home because their mothers couldn't come and pick them up. And Mother said yes. But I started screaming in the car because there were too many people in it, and Jack and Polly weren't in my class, and Jack bangs his head on things and makes a noise like an animal. And I tried to get out of the car, but it was still going along, and I fell out onto the road, and I had to have stitches in my head, and they had to shave the hair off, and it took 3 months for it to grow back to the way it was before. So I stood very still in the train carriage and didn't move. And then I heard someone say, "Christopher!" And I thought it would be someone I knew, like a teacher from school or one of the policemen who lived in our street, but it wasn't. It was the policeman again. And he said, "Caught you just in time." And he was breathing really loud and holding his knees. And I didn't say anything. And he said, "We've got your father at the police station." And I thought he was going to say that they had arrested father for killing Wellington, but he didn't. He said, "He's looking for you." And I said, "I know." And he said, "So why are you going to London?" And I said, "Because I'm going to live with Mother." And he said, "Well, I think your father might have something to say about that." And then I thought that he was going to take me back to father, and that was frightening because he was a policeman, and policemen are meant to be good. So I started to run away, but he grabbed me and I screamed, and then he let go, and he said, "Okay, let's not get overexcited here." And then he said, "I'm going to take you back to the police station, and you and me and your dad can sit down and have a little chat about what's going on, about who's going where." And I said, "I'm going to live with Mother in London." And he said, "Not just yet, you're not." And I said, "Have you arrested father?" And he said, "Arrested him? What for?" And I said, "He killed a dog with a garden fork. The dog was called Wellington." And the policeman said, "Did he now?" And I said, "Yes, he did." And he said, "Well, we can talk about that as well." And then he said, "Right, young man, I think you've done enough adventuring for one day." And then he reached out to touch me again, and I started to scream again. And he said, "Now listen, you little monkey, you can either do what I say or I'm going to have to make..." And then the train jiggled and it began to move. And then the policeman said, "Shitting fuck." And then he looked at the ceiling of the train, and he put his hands together in front of his mouth, like people do when they are praying to God in heaven, and he breathed really loudly into his hands and made a whistling noise. And then he stopped because the train jiggled again, and he had to grab hold of one of the straps, which were hanging from the ceiling. And then he said, "Don't move." And then he took his walkie-talkie and pressed a button and said, "Rob, yeah, it's Nigel. I'm stuck on the bloody train. Yeah, don't even. Look, it stops at Didcot Parkway, so if you can get someone to meet me with a car. Cheers. Tell his old man we've got him, but it's going to take a while, okay?" Great. Then he clicked his walkie-talkie off and he said, "Let's get ourselves a seat." And he pointed to two long seats nearby which faced each other, and he said, "Park yourself. No monkey business." And the people who were sitting on the seats got up and walked away because he was a policeman, and we sat down facing one another. And he said, "You are a bloody handful, you are. Jeez." And I wondered whether the policeman would help me find 451C Chapter Road, London, NW2 5NG. And I looked out of the window, and we were going past factories and scrapyards full of old cars, and there were 4 caravans in a muddy field with 2 dogs and some clothes hanging up to dry. And outside the window was like a map, except that it was in 3 dimensions and it was life-size, because it was the thing it was a map of. And there were so many things it made my head hurt, so I closed my eyes. But then I opened them again because it was like flying, but nearer to the ground, and I think flying is good. And then the countryside started, and there were fields and cows and horses, and a bridge and a farm, and more houses, and lots of little roads with cars on them. And that made me think that there must be millions of miles of train track in the world, and they all go past houses and roads and rivers and fields. And that made me think how many people must be in the world, and they all have houses and roads to travel on, and cars and pets and clothes, and they all eat lunch and go to bed and have names, and this made my head hurt too. So I closed my eyes again and did counting and groaning. And when I opened my eyes, the policeman was reading a newspaper called The Sun, and on the front of the paper it said, 3 million Andersons call girl shame, and it had a picture of a man with a picture of a lady in a bra underneath. And then I did some maths practice in my head, solving quadratic equations using the formula x equals minus b plus minus square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. And then I wanted to go for a wee, but I was on a train, and I didn't know how long it would take us to get to London, and I felt a panic starting, and I started to tap a rhythm on the glass with my knuckles to help me wait and not think about wanting to go for a wee. And I looked at my watch, and I waited for 17 minutes. But when I want to go for a wee, I have to go really quickly, which is why I like to be at home or at school. And I always go for a wee before I get on the bus, which is why I leaked a bit and wet my trousers. And then the policeman looked across at me and said, "Oh, Christ, you've..." And then he put his newspaper down and said, "For God's sake, go to the bloody toilet, will you?" And I said, "But I'm on a train." And he said, "They do have toilets on trains, you know." And I said, "Where is the toilet on the train?" And he pointed and said, "Through those doors there, but I'll be keeping an eye on you, understand?" And I said, "No," because I knew what keeping an eye on someone meant, but he couldn't look at me when I was in the toilet. And he said, "Just go to the bloody toilet." So I got up out of my seat and I closed my eyes so that my eyelids were just little slits, so I couldn't see the other people on the train. And I walked to the door, and when I got through the door, there was another door on the right, and it was half open, and it said toilet on it, so I went inside. And it was horrible inside because there was poo on the seat of the toilet, and it smelled of poo, like the toilet at school when Joseph has been for a poo on his own, because he plays with it. And I didn't want to use the toilet because of the poo, which was the poo of people I didn't know and brown, but I had to because I really wanted to wee. So I closed my eyes and went for a wee, and the train wobbled and lots went on the seat and on the floor, but I wiped my penis with toilet paper and flushed the toilet, and then I tried to use the sink, but the tap didn't work, so I put spit on my hands and wiped them with a paper tissue and put it into the toilet. Then I went out of the toilet, and I saw that opposite the toilet there were two shelves with cases and a rucksack on them, and it made me think of the airing cupboard at home and how I climb in there sometimes and it makes me feel safe. So I climbed onto the middle shelf, and I put one of the cases across like a door so that I was shut in. And it was dark and there was no one in there with me, and I couldn't hear people talking, so I felt much calmer, and it was nice. And I did some more quadratic equations like 0 equals 437x squared plus 103x plus 11, and 0 equals 79x squared plus 43x plus 2089. And I made some of the coefficients large so that they were hard to solve. And then the train started to slow down, and someone came and stood near the shelf and knocked on the door of the toilet, and it was the policeman, and he said, "Christopher! Christopher!" And then he opened the door of the toilet and said, "Bloody hell!" And he was really close so that I could see his walkie-talkie and his truncheon on his belt, and I could smell his aftershave. But he didn't see me, and I didn't say anything, because I didn't want him to take me to father. And then he went away again, running. And then the train stopped, and I wondered if it was London, but I didn't move because I didn't want the policeman to find me. And then a lady with a jumper that had bees and flowers made of wool on it came and took the rucksacks off the shelf over my head, and she said, "You scared the living daylights out of me." And I didn't say anything. And then she said, "I think someone out there's on the platform looking for you." But I carried on, not saying anything. And she said, "Well, it's your lookout." And she went away. And then three other people walked past, and one of them was a black man in a long white dress, and he put a big parcel on the shelf above my head, but he didn't see me. And then the train started going again. Chapter 199. People believe in God because the world is very complicated, and they think it is very unlikely that anything as complicated as a flying squirrel or the human eye or a brain could happen by chance. But they should think logically, and if they thought logically, they would see that they can only ask this question because it has already happened and they exist. And there are billions of planets where there is no life, and there is no one on those planets with brains to notice. And it is like if everyone in the world were tossing coins, eventually someone would get 5,698 heads in a row, and they would think that they were very special. But they wouldn't, because there would be millions of people who didn't get 5,698 heads. And there is life on Earth because of an accident, but it is a very special kind of accident. And for this accident to happen in this special way, there have to be three conditions. And these are: 1. Things have to make copies of themselves. This is called replication. 2. They have to make small mistakes when they do this. This is called mutation. 3. These mistakes have to be the same in their copies. This is called heritability. And these conditions are very rare, but they are possible, and they cause life. And it just happens. But it doesn't have to end up with rhinoceroses and human beings and whales. It could end up with anything. And for example, some people say, how can an eye happen by accident? Because an eye has to evolve from something else very like an eye, and it doesn't just happen because of a genetic mistake. And what is the use of half an eye? But half an eye is very useful because half an eye means that an animal can see half of an animal that wants to eat it and get out of the way, and it will eat the animal that only has a third of an eye or 49% of an eye instead because it hasn't got out of the way quick enough. And the animal that is eaten won't have babies because it is dead. And 1% of an eye is better than no eye. And people who believe in God think God has put human beings on the earth because they think human beings are the best animal. But human beings are just an animal, and they will evolve into another animal, and that animal will be cleverer, and it will put human beings into a zoo, like we put chimpanzees and gorillas into a zoo. Or human beings will all catch a disease and die out, or they will make too much pollution and kill themselves, and then there will only be insects in the world, and they will be the best animal.